Good day and welcome to Bible Class Topics. We're studying 2 Corinthians. This is Paul's second letter to the church at Corinth. We're calling our study Strength to Serve, and today we want to look at chapter 8, the entire chapter, verses 1 through 24. The letter can be divided into three distinct sections. We just last week finished our study of chapters 1 through 7 as Paul explains his ministry. Here in chapter 8 and, Lord willing, in our next lesson, chapter 9, Paul will encourage the generosity of the Corinthian church. And then finally, in chapters 10 through 13, Paul will have to enforce his authority because there are false teachers that have crept in to the Corinthian church, and they need to be dealt with. In chapter 8 and 9, we see Paul encouraging their generosity as individuals and as a congregation. We're going to talk about principles of grace giving in chapter 8, and then we'll talk about promises for the grace givers in chapter 9. Paul makes an urgent appeal to the Corinthians in chapter 8 and 9 to complete their fellowship. We'll notice that in verse 8, or chapter 8, I should say, in verse 4. To complete their fellowship in the contribution to the poor saints in Jerusalem. And Paul reveals his plans to maintain the project above suspicion of dishonest handling of the funds. This section highlights how the grace of God motivates or enriches contributors to share their gifts liberally and abundantly, as Melvin said in his commentary on the book. The gift would be given in selfless love by the Gentile Christians to Jewish Christians in an atmosphere of distrust on the part of both groups. The success of the gift would serve as a setback to both the Judaizing teachers and the Hellenizing teachers, and these factions were obvious in the church at this time in its history, according to Philip in his commentary on the book. So with those introductory thoughts, let's get our Bibles out, and we'll be prepared to read the first 15 verses in just a moment. When we talk about principles of grace giving, we'll try to notice these points as we make our reading. God's grace, the Macedonians' liberality, Titus being a willing helper, the fact that the Corinthians were already abounding in other works, a look at Jesus' example, the fact that the Corinthians had already begun to make their collection, equality among the believers, great administrators, and proof of their love. Now let's read. I'm reading from the ESV, chapter 8, the first 15 verses. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urge Titus, that as he started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. And in this matter I give my judgment, this benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. And as it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. So here we see an appeal for generosity. We hear arguments as to why the Corinthians should be willing to send aid to the Jerusalem church. He starts with the example of other Christians. The Macedonians were poor. They were poorer than the Corinthians, but they had given generously. We know that Aristarchus of Thessalonica gave of himself. Later on, he enrolled himself as Paul's servant and accompanied him to prison. We know that Epaphroditus brought gifts to the imprisoned Paul from Philippi, and while there he fell ill and he nearly died. Let's take a reading from Philippians Chapter 2. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need, for he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor. Honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. And the Macedonians. The Macedonian spirit of generosity, which transcended national loyalties, transcended racial preferences, and transcended congregational differences, should motivate saints of God today to unite in our desire to alleviate the needs of Christians, not only locally, but around the world. A word about the word fellowship. From verse 4, the word fellowship is found in the King James Version. In our version that we are reading, the SV, the same word is translated relief of. In general, when Paul uses the term for fellowship, he is using it to describe an active participation. And thus, here in verse 4, it is easily translated relief of by the ESV and other of the more modern translations. What of the example of Jesus? Before the cross, before his birth, Jesus began his giving by laying aside his glory and agreeing to come to earth. Personal giving is always the highest kind of giving, as Christ has shown us. Let me share this quote from James Denny. Ordinary charity is but the crumbs from the rich man's table. But if we catch Christ's spirit, it will carry us far beyond that. The example of their past giving is given by Paul here in this reading. Apparently, the Corinthians were one of the first churches to give to this need. One commentator said, "It's necessary to turn a fine feeling into a fine action." And so it is. We can feel for the hungry, but if we don't help them get some food, they'll still be the hungry. We can feel for the naked, but if we don't help them get some clothes, they'll still be naked. A fine feeling must be turned into a fine action. Life has a way of evening things up. God does not measure the Corinthians' contribution, which is being given out of their abundance, as more than the contribution of the Macedonians, which was being given out of their poverty. Each contribution is measured as equal in God's sight without respecting the difference in the amounts. It's through the equality of sharing the burden of giving without any undue pressure on any individual church that the work of benevolence is accomplished. Melvin Curry in his commentary on the book. Remember Exodus 16:18, the people would go out and gather the manna, and regardless of whether they gathered little or gathered a lot, it was sufficient. Keep that in mind as we talk about this stage of Paul's argument. In this stage, we see the bases of gracious giving emerge. First of all, verse 12, the gift is provided out of what one has, not out of what one has not. And then in verse 13 and 14, the giving grows out of the principle of equality before God. I've been sharing quite a few comments from my good friend Philip Shumake from some notes that he left me concerning this book, 2 Corinthians. Let me share a few of his thoughts right here. What are the reasons for engaging in benevolence that stir us up today? What stirs us to benevolence? Some of these reasons that we've already given, or some others that come to your mind. Does the nature of the need stir you to benevolence? Does our connection to a certain person stir us to benevolence? Does our ability to help? Are these the same things that stir us to benevolence? We're talking about God's grace in this chapter. It's wonderful to remember, but notice that it's the grace of God at work in Macedonia that Paul has here in mind. He's sharing this idea with the Corinthians. It's not just that God has given us Jesus. Here's the point. The other people have responded to God's grace generously. You can too, Corinthians. We can too. In our congregations, in our daily lives, we can respond generously. In fact, if we will just remember how richly God has blessed us, we will be begging to participate in giving back to Him. We're not advocating reckless giving here, but we're pointing out that there will always be people who can tell you that you are giving too much, even good people. But giving as God deserves is always going to require more than we may initially feel able to give. We have to give of our own accord. We have to give of our own free will. The joy will not come from doing it out of guilt. The joy will not come from trying to keep up with the Joneses in their giving. The joy will only come when you prayerfully consider how much you can give to the Lord and do it when you purpose that amount. But that doesn't mean you are to ignore the urgings of others. God is using Paul here in a wonderful way to stir up the Corinthians. And God may use others in your life today to stir you up into your giving. Let's go back to verse 4 one more time. In verse 4, we see that the Corinthians know exactly what their giving is for. It's for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Does the congregation where you attend post the monthly financial report? Or do they email it out to the members? You need to look it over. If you're not reading the financial report, you don't know where your money is going. If you don't know that your money is going to great works, then certainly there is a lack of desire to give. When you get involved in knowing what is going on, whether it's the saints or evangelistic work or supporting preachers, you can be stirred to giving liberally. We have to understand, as Paul makes clear in this passage, that it's God that makes all this possible. If God needs me to use his money for my family, or if God needs me to use his money in the kingdom, I'm willing to, because it's God's money. It's God's money to begin with, and I will put it wherever he desires it to be. Let's say a word about Titus. What a friend Titus was. The Corinthians loved Titus, as we see in 7:15. We all need a Titus every now and then in our lives. Someone who just has a better picture of the work we're considering. The Corinthians know their money is being well invested spiritually because they aren't just giving that money to anybody. They're entrusting it to be carried to the right place by Titus. Let's read the rest of the chapter, make a few comments, and that will be our lesson for today. Verse 16, but thanks be to God who put in the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you, for he has not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us, for we aim at what is honorable not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them we're sending our brother whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers for the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. These are practical arrangements. This is how they are going to make this collection and how they're going to deliver it to Jerusalem in a way that everyone will be satisfied that all of this business is above board. Paul was aware of his enemies and critics. To avoid being accused of any improprieties, he enlisted the help of others to take the gift to Jerusalem. It's interesting that Paul the poet and Paul the theologian could also think like an accountant when it became necessary for him to do so. Paul wanted this collection completed before he arrived in Corinth, and he wanted all the churches to choose their own messengers to carry the money and everyone involved to act with integrity. Linda Belleville had this thought in her book. Beyond these things, Paul wants to approve of the good deeds and ideas of these churches and to combine his ideas and actions with the best of theirs. A good lesson for us. The greater confidence in our brethren leads to greater diligence in our love towards them and a greater willingness on our part to support their work. Verse 24. Two things I'd like to say about a sure demonstration of their love. And that's, first of all, as according to chapter 8, verse 8, their gift will provide concrete evidence of their love. And as we'll see in chapter 9, in our next lesson, it will justify Paul's boasting on their part to the Macedonians. So just as Paul had boasted on the part of the Macedonians to the Corinthians, we'll see that he's also reciprocated that boasting. What about our individual giving? There's three things we need to remember about our Sunday giving. We need to remember that it is service in Christ's kingdom. We need to remember that our giving is gracious work towards others. And we need to remember that our giving is generous gifts to meet the needs that we become aware of. If we want to follow the pattern of the New Testament, we need to give directly to preachers, or we need to give directly to congregations in need. And just because we find out some other congregation is doing something, that doesn't mean we can't do it as well. What we can't do is let them do it for us. We should never throw money at problems, never. But we are to care enough to send money when and where it is needed. The churches of the first century saw to their own giving. They sent the money directly to where it was needed. Well, that brings our study of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 to a close. Thank you for watching. Thank you for participating with me in this study of this letter from the Apostle Paul. Please support the channel in any way you can. Of course, we never, ever ask for monetary donations to the channel. We simply want you to help spread the news of the channel by subscribing to the channel, sharing a link with your friends, loved ones, and family. I hope all is well where you are. Let's keep each other in our prayers until we meet again. May God bless.